I'm Dr. Gail Gross. My guest today is a worldwide authority on religion, spirituality, Asian history, Tibetan Buddhism, and the Dalai Lama. Robert Thurman has a gift for making complex philosophical concepts understandable. He is the chairman of religious studies at Columbia University, where he holds the first endowed chair in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist studies in America. He also travels all over the world, lecturing to universities, companies, and think tanks. He was named one of Time magazine's 25 most influential Americans and has appeared on Oprah, NBC's Today Show, and CNN. Robert Thurman's close relationship with the Dalai Lama and his commitment to the Tibetan cause led him to co-found Tibet House in 1987 with Richard Gere and Philip Glass. Since that time, Tibet House has recently expanded to include the Menla Mountain Retreat Center. Robert Thurman is also a celebrated writer. His articles have appeared in Rolling Stone and Mother Jones. He translated the centuries-old classic, The Tibetan Book of the Dead, and his own book, Inner Revolution, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Real Happiness was chosen by Publishers Weekly as one of the best books of 1998. His most recent book, Infinite Life, 7 Virtues for Living Well, has been called his finest book to date. Robert Thurman, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Gail.
There's a new first book, Anger.
Yes.
So let's start here,
Okay.
because it's your newest book, and then we'll go backwards
Okay.
and talk about the 7 virtues for living. But
Thank
before
you.
we go into either of these directions, I want to ask how you began.
Well, it's really a mystery in a way, probably because of my previous life. I had this affinity. You know, I grew up right here in New York, and went to the normal schools here on the East Side, and grew up, supposedly, and had my ups and downs. But I never felt that sort of comfortable in American culture. There was always some piece missing for me, I think. But anyway, eventually in my teens, I began to read about Buddhism and became really fascinated with that. And then in my around 20, I lost an eye,
Yes.
which was a kind of terrible blow in a way. But in another way, it was tremendous benefit and a wonderful advantage, because it opened my other eye, my spiritual eye, you could say, towards the deeper meanings of life, realizing that life is very, very fragile and you can lose it. And I could have lost my life even at that time.
Yes.
So then I went to India seeking spiritual teachings. I felt something would be there in India. I didn't actually find anyone until I met the Tibetan people, and then it was like a homecoming.
What happened when you got there? I mean, what was the next thing?
Well, the next thing I think was the language. When I discovered the Tibetan language, it just blew my mind. I was speaking fluently in 10 weeks.
Amazing.
The alphabet was like a paradise to me. It was such a great thing compared to A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Amazing. I remember you telling me once that you had your language teacher was so amazed that you could pick up this language.
That's true.
In such a short
I was
period of
too.
time. And
Just stuck to my bones instantly.
and then you were able to read.
Yes.
And then how did you find your way to His Holiness, the Dalai Lama?
Well, he was the sort of, most important person, and it was hard to see him. But once I learned the language very much, I was kind of a phenomenon amongst the Tibetans, the first sort of white person who really spoke well. And because of my interest in the Dharma, and yoga, and my knowledge of the language, then I pretty easily got to meet His Holiness. He wasn't so busy like he is now.
Yeah.
And he was much younger. He was only 6 years older than me. And we just immediately hit it off, And I would ask him questions about Buddhism, and he would ask me questions about America, about New York, about Washington, about democracy, about philosophy, whatever it was, science,
Yeah.
Humanities, literature, history, every subject you can think of.
So you became friends.
Yeah, we really did.
And each other's teachers.
Yes, he sent me to his teachers. He would always brush aside my questions to him as a teacher and say, "No, you ask so and so," and he assigned me these older teachers who were actually the same teachers that he studied with.
And then you decided to become a monk.
That
What
was
a decision.
I know. Well, basically, not such a huge decision in Tibetan culture. In Tibetan culture, being a monk is sort of like getting a lifelong MacArthur Fellowship.
Yes.
You just get grant, people take care of you, you study, you meditate, you do what you want to do. And you're just nourished in the center of the society by the culture. And so I was temporarily in that refugee bubble of the Dharamsala, of the mini Tibetan culture, and I was sure I was going to spend my life at it. Now my old teacher, the old Mongolian who had also helped me, he said, you shouldn't do that because you won't stay. He told even His Holiness, he said, he's very smart and he's this and that, he has a good mind, but he won't really last as a monk. Yes. So then His Holiness was also just fresh out of Tibet.
Yes.
And for him, again, it was the most natural, and it wasn't such a big sacrifice or hard thing. Mm-hmm. So he, more or less, after a year or so, he ordained me. Yes. And then I did resign after 3 or 4 years, and he was a little bit disappointed, I can say.
Yes. Then you went back to Harvard.
Then I went back to Harvard, our Western monastery. That's right.
In a certain way, was it true that you began to realize that you could accomplish more, serve better the Tibetan cause by, in a sense, entering this Western monastery, the university?
So. That was part of the motivation, yes. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, people would want to say, well, maybe I just couldn't take the discipline or something.
Or celibacy?
Or celibacy. Some people might say, I had already been married, actually, once. And, so I was not, I knew about that end of life, but it wasn't very difficult, actually, celibacy.
Yeah, interesting.
And in fact, you get actually kind of calm about the whole thing. Mm-hmm. You sublimate those energies.
Yes.
But it really was that in this country at that time, in the early 60s, people really had no idea what was a Buddhist monk. We didn't even have Hare Krishna people on the corners. Not yet. That was later in the 60s.
Exactly.
And everybody just thought, like, who is this guy in a red dress, with a weird
blonde hair.
Head, There was no hair because
no hair, yes, exactly.
Umut says that I looked like Henry Miller in drag. They just thought I was kind of nutty, And that time, remember, we had the whole Vietnam War problem, the civil rights problem.
Exactly.
And I felt I should be more engaged with America from a stronger vantage point.
Yes.
And obviously that meant going back to school. And my old teacher recommended I go back to school and so on. And then, of course, the minute I wasn't a monk, I met Nina and I fell totally in love.
Yes.
And then that was lucky because, she helped kind of steer me in the right direction, too.
And again, this karmic destiny, she was on your journey.
She was.
Funnily enough. And then, of course, your children, you just mentioned Uma. We have to say that's Uma Thurman.
Yes.
And you have other children,
I have 3 boys, yes. 3 boys. I have an older daughter from the previous marriage, Taya, who's wonderful.
Yes. So then you finished at Harvard.
Right.
And then your mission really began. And your mission really was focused on the Tibetan people.
I guess at first I could say that it was more on the Buddhist thought.
Yes.
Because almost like a scientist rather than religion. I feel that the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness, as they call it, or reality, sort of the Buddhist metaphysic, is the most amazing metaphysic in the world. It's not like a religious thing. They don't really believe in a creator God. They believe there are gods, but that no one super controlling deity. They don't believe that.
No supreme
They believe
deity.
in love, that everyone should be more loving. That if you discover what is real, you will find these divine forces at the heart of the universe, something like that. And I was interested in sharing that with the West and translating books and things like that. It was, I guess, only when I reached my mid-30s or something, when I was feeling a little more relaxed and more cheerful, like sort of grateful, I would say, about having encountered the Tibetan culture, that I decided as a payback that I really had to do something to try to help the Tibetan people. And as a joyful, as an enjoyable thing, because I like them.
And your research, I guess, really brought you to this feeling of preserving also their culture, their heritage, their art, and then you created Tibet House, which does exactly that.
That's right. That's the piece that His Holiness asked me to do. There are others who work on Tibetan sort of refugee assistance, immediate economic. There are others who work on the political oppression and the human rights problems.
But you did culture.
But he asked me to kind of work on the culture, and he asked Richard Gere to help me initially. And Tibet, many people don't know this, but Tibet is the one country on the planet in the 300 years ago that about the time that Europe was out conquering the whole planet for imperialism,
exactly.
Tibet was becoming nonviolent and demilitarized as a country. By being sort of a neutral country in Central Asia in those centuries, Tibet was able to maintain a greater degree of peace among the Mongols, who had been, of course, everyone knows, extremely violent, and then among the Manchus, who were the conquerors of China in the last 300 years, and they kept much more peace by being sort of non-military, and just the Lamas were like Lama diplomats, you could say.
And I think that went on for like 5 centuries.
Yeah, that went on for many centuries. And finally, the Mongolians also imitated the Tibetan culture, you could say, or adopted it.
Yes.
And they became demilitarized and non-violent, which left them have a much more happy culture, although again, sort of at the end of history in the last century, both the Mongols and the Tibetans got raked over it by the Russian communists, the case of the Mongols, and Chinese communists, the case of Tibetan.
Yes.
But on the other hand, look at us all today. We're all in this situation of the 21st century, which should be a century of peace. And we're all tied up in these unwinnable conflicts where nobody really is obviously winning ever. And actually, even there's a theory that some social thinkers have come up with, which I agree with, which is that the technology of warfare and communication today is such, and the inter-immigration of people is so huge, every country is pluralistic melting pot, not just U.S., that in a way no one can win a war anymore. Do you know what I mean? No, you can destroy something, but you can't really control it after you destroy it. You know what I mean? Jonathan Shell has written a wonderful book called The Unconquerable World, which very much connects with my Inner Revolution book without any conscious design. His is all from Western sources, as mine is from Eastern sources. Bob. And both of us talk about unconquerable world. No one can conquer it anymore, you know what I mean? So we have to be cooperative instead.
Tell us about that Inner Revolution.
Yes, well, the Inner Revolution book, I think, traces the development of the Inner Revolution over the last at least 2,500 years, maybe a little longer, coming from the time of the Buddha. And the first Inner Revolution, I would say, the core Inner Revolution is a revolution in the Buddha's own mind. And that is based on his insight into precisely seeing the source of suffering in the universe, being for sensitive beings, living beings, being the precisely the self-preoccupation, the narcissism, the self-involvement, and based itself not as a moralistic thing, he understood it, but almost as a scientific thing, based on the false idea that I'm the actual real thing in the world. And everything else is less real. And then myself wanting to put myself over the world, so to speak, and therefore going into struggle with the world. And that is the source of suffering, the way he understood it. Why? Because the world is always more than me. I can never satisfactorily dominate it. I will always lose in the long run. I'll have maybe temporary edge on some small environment, but in the long run I lose. Buddha spotted that. And then he had a revolution where he realized that the source of happiness really is the happiness of others, and is putting others ahead of yourself. Altruism, in other words. This was the real way of changing the world, was from internal change in the people of the world. So the Inner Revolution is a revolution in the individual heart, but that it manifests throughout all the society. And it changed Asia, actually. India was a powerful military country, people don't realize. They were very tough. And yet they became peaceful after several hundred years of, generation by generation, turning that striving towards self-conquest, inner revolution, instead of outer conquest. It was actually also a very rich country, so they had the leisure to do that, actually, like we do today here. But in those days, India was much richer than Europe or than West Asia. So I traced that through the history of India into the history of Tibet and Mongolia, with this sort of process of this inner revolution, the demilitarizing of societies, the disarming of families, the developing of gentleness among the elevation of women, actually, because in the case of Tibet and Mongolia, we could say that people just chose a way of living, and in India before that was more gentle and peaceful. And this did make them vulnerable, and they were invaded, and they did suffer. Later generations did suffer because of that. And yet, of course, then in order to really deal with that, this is where my Infinite Life book, I come around to this point. You see, to really reach a higher level of these self-transcending virtues, one has to sort of put them on the level of life and death, actually, unfortunately. So that that's an equal and opposite force. Do you know what I mean? And yet it's even a greater force, because these are people who really understand the soul essence of life. S-O-U-L, soul essence. That the soul is infinite, that the continuum of the soul is infinite, and that there's something more important than just keeping hold of your life. That kindness, that love, that truthfulness, heroism is more important actually than life itself. The gentle people have to have that ability.
Talk to us about the virtues.
The major Buddhist virtues are generosity, justice or morality,
Yes.
ethics, ethics, patience, or tolerance,
Yes.
Creativity, I call it. Usually people just say effort or industry. But creativity, I call it, because it's a particular joyous energy to do positive things, which I think is creativity.
Yes.
Meditation or concentration, wisdom, and then the seventh one is, I call it art, which means living in such a way that the life itself is an art. So the art is the art of living, living lovingly, and living happily, and living beautifully. And it comes from wisdom and concentration and creativity and patience and ethics and generosity. So the previous 6 build up to that, but the thing about, for example, then the patience one is the one where you deal with anger. When you develop patience, there are different layers of patience, which are what is called tolerance patience, insightful patience, and forgiving patience. And then the forgiving patience then moves right into love,
So in a certain way, Bob, you can consciously develop, what you're saying is to take responsibility from a psychological model.
Right.
Take responsibility for your behavior and, in a sense, your feelings.
Yes, that's right.
Which is a fascinating idea.
That's right. You can't just suppress them.
No.
But although it's good actually not to vent anger.
Yes.
Because it's painful when you restrain it.
But you can choose to control it.
But if you remain aware of it and restrain it, then that energy boils around in such a way that it'll give you the motive to try to really understand it, so you won't lose yourself to it again.
So if you're in awareness, in a certain way, your own witness.
That's right.
Then you are actually transforming.
That's right. It's the awareness that is key.
Yeah. They speak so much about Christ's lost years in the East.
Yes.
And Ladakh.
Oh, sure.
And, of course, there's a whole school of thought that Jung, Marie von Franz writes that at the end of Jung's life, he had this horrific dream.
He did.
And the dream was of chaos and destruction at this very time, because he felt that the world as a whole refused to face their shadow.
That's right.
And continued country by country to project out their shadow to their neighbor.
That's right.
And the chaos was necessary so that they could reintegrate or bring that shadow home. And at that point, you'd have the end of the warrior period and the rebirth of the feminine.
Oh, he saw that in the dream. How
that
nice.
was his
That's
dream.
Nice.
So a hopeful,
had a good ending.
the hopeful period to come after this destructive period, the end of this warrior period.
I know. Well, that's the Armageddon idea, and also we have it in Buddhism with the Shambala idea.
And it's so funny that you raised the idea of Shambala, because I've always wanted you to explain this to me.
The Shambala Prophecy of this country being somewhere hidden in the North Pole area or something, and
sort of like
coming
far
out at the
horizons.
end of history, and coming out at the end of history, and like solving all the military conflict and preventing the planet from being destroyed actually by military conflict, and then having ushering in a golden age. He says he doesn't believe in that. His Holiness. And but I do, in the sense that I feel that, and I feel all the great seers of all the world religions have seen the trends of these recent millennia leading to a place where the human species is almost in the danger of self-destruction. And where sort of technologies and knowledge is so powerful that they can even destroy the entire planet. And then something happens at that time where some people sort of wake up in a large numbers, and then they put a stop to that violent way of being. That they had been, the way they had been behaving, what Jonathan Shell calls the war system, and has the war system self-destructs, you could say, and then you have a peace system. So I do believe, in that sense, when I said I believe in Shambhala, I do believe that. I've never had a trace of the country hiding in the North Pole. I wish it was there. Sometimes I think it is America, Shambhala, actually.
Interesting.
In the sense that if you go north from India and Mongolia and Tibet, you go over the pole, you reach America.
Well, I always think
follow me?
I do. I always think of something you taught me a long time ago. You said, think if everybody in the world was in this train car. And we were all on this, in this train car together. That means the warrior, that means the peaceful person, the indigent person, the dying person, the diseased person, the leper, every kind of person you can think of in this train car together for eternity. And no one could get off. Do you want to Tell us a little bit.
Well,
Do you
that's the
remember?
reality.
Should I remind you of
Yes,
that more?
thank you. You have such a good memory, Gail.
That was wonderful.
That's wonderful.
That was a wonderful lesson.
That is the vision of the Buddhist vision of the world, actually,
Yes.
and many other cultures too, actually.
Yes.
Even I would say it's the Christian one, although they're using the language of God, they don't fill in the details that well. For example, the Buddhists believe that life is beginningless. The Christian thinks, well, the world had a beginning, but they think God is beginningless, and they realize that God is life. And so in a way, they also have life is beginningless. Do you follow me? But they don't make a detail.
We're just talking about, in a certain way, language.
That's right. And then also the world is endless, the Buddhists believe.
Right.
Infinite.
Right.
And the theistic people,
Also.
they think God is infinite.
Yes.
Even though maybe the world comes to an end in Armageddon or something.
Right.
So in a way, most people really realize the boundlessness of life, or what I call infinite life.
Right.
And the infinite life perspective is that we're here together forever.
Right.
We are. It isn't like if we were just stuck in a train car. That's just an analogy.
Right.
Because we all know that when we go get in a train car, or subway car actually, in New York is what I usually say, we don't want to have much to do with the other people on the car. We kind of don't pay attention to them. We read our book. We don't want them looking at it. We get frightened if they look at us.
Right.
We want to have minimal involvement because we feel we will never see them again. We'll just get out of the car.
And no intimacy, interestingly enough.
That's right. No closeness.
Right.
But if we are going to be in that car with them
Yes.
forever, then of course we're really looking at them and who's friend and who's what, and we want them all to be. We don't want anybody really freaking out because we're just in a close quarters there. We can't have it.
Right.
So the thing is, like you and I are having this interview in this life, but we've been interviewing each other for many lives.
Yes.
And we just forgot.
Right.
Beginninglessly we have.
Yes.
We've been relatives. You've been my mother. I've been your mother,
Right.
actually. And every other relationship. But
I want to talk to you about that.
I'm sure you do. And so this realization means that you can never dismiss another person.
Right.
Even they annoying you, even temporarily you want to walk away because maybe there's a bad scene happening or something. You realize that you have to deal with everyone because they're going to be back again. For example, the ultimate way of dismissing someone in the shorter vision of life is killing them, of course, because you think, well, you've gotten them out of your world.
Right.
But from this deeper point of view, their soul comes back.
Right.
They're reborn. If you kill them in the last life, they're going to be mad as heck the next life.
Right.
And it's going to make it worse. So, in other words, it gives you a different level of commitment to other beings and to your own actions because you realize they're going to always keep coming back at you.
Right.
Just like when you're in a family, you have to be committed to the other person because they're going to be there. And obviously, the optimal way of relating to other beings is to love them and to have them love you. So that means they want you to be happy, you want them to be happy.
Yes.
There's no conflict, no fighting, no harming.
Yes.
That's the optimal way.
And
so the idea is that all beings should become like that.
Yes.
And this is Jesus' teaching. He calls it the kingdom of God.
Yes.
And Buddha calls it the Buddha land, the Buddha verse.
Yes.
And in Tibetan Buddhism, with that prophecy, they call it Shambala, the time of Shambala.
And interestingly enough, they all say it's within you. The kingdom of God is
absolutely
within you. And there's a Buddhist mantra, actually Dzogchen,
Yeah, that's right.
which holds a very special meaning because it is the heart mantra.
Yes.
That heart to heart,
Yes.
Sufis believe, is the only way to connect. So before we say goodbye, I must ask you, what was the defining moment of your life?
Well, I guess the defining moment of my life was when I, probably maybe when I met my wife.
Yes.
Somehow, I mean, there are a lot of defining moments, big turnarounds, sort of insights and experiences of this and that, sort of, like altered states, you could say, or something like that. But in a way, the really defining moment was when I met my wife, and I saw her as representing everything good in the universe,
Yes.
and everything that I loved, and that then put me on a trajectory, I would say, of trying to make myself a little less obnoxious. And I would say re-meeting His Holiness in 1979, after having, known him, but hadn't seen him for about 6 or 7 years, after he had changed a lot.
How did you meet him?
The time I'm talking about is when he first came to America in 79, and I met him, I think, here in New York, at the Waldorf Astoria, actually, I think. And I had this vision, and I dreamed about him the night before, and had this amazing vision of him.
Yes.
Quite different, and it was from that time that I began to look at him as a guru, kind of, or as a teacher, as my main teacher.
Yes.
Although my wife has been a main teacher, my old Geshe was a main teacher, and I had a number of others, but somehow they all kind of got folded into him in some way. And that's at that same level of defining moment, I think, you know. And even last April I had a defining moment where I got a chance to receive some teachings from him in Dharamsala that he had promised me for years, but we hadn't had a chance to really do, because there's some sort of like rarefied thing.
Right.
You know, and that week, it was about a week, or maybe longer, 8-9 days, some teachings that he gave, and the way I saw him then, and the way those teachings sort of resonated with my mind, was something really, really marvelous.
And transformative.
Very transformative, I think, really. I mean, not that I can... Still, it's so hard to change this lump of me, but somehow moving in the right direction. It was sort of, those are moments, you know, that you feel there's some hope and some possibility, you know.
Yeah. Well, don't change too much because you're wonderful.
Oh, well, that's very kind.
Thank you for this wonderful visit. It's always such an honor.
It's great to see you. I love it that you're doing these talks. I think they're great.
Thank you. Well, you're great.
You're obviously very gifted and born to do it.
Well, you've been one of my greatest teachers. So for you to say that means a lot to me.
Very nice.
Robert Thurman, you have always shown us a way to plunge into the ocean of boundless freedom to discover the reality of infinite life. And today we were all rewarded. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching. I'm Dr. Gail Gross.